I'm a very picky guy. So, okay, so hopefully this will disappear now.
Yes,
I would like to thank very much for the organizers and Ali's Opsi.
Bring it to
And Ali talked about auctions, and my talk will be actually related, although the application will be very different. So let me first talk about my field, market design, which is one of the most active fields in microeconomics, and auction theory auction theory and empirical auctions belongs to that field. It's called market design. And especially over the last 2 decades, economists started taking a lot of role in designing institutions. And the emerging field of market design often focuses on resource allocation problems where traditional market institutions might not work so well for various reasons. And research on this field is mainly influenced by research in microtheory and industrial organization. And it brings together theoretical, empirical, experimental methods with an objective of studying policy-relevant trade-offs of practical impact. So that's what we are trying to do. Now, 2 fields that has been prominent in the development of market design have been auction theory, and Ali gave a wonderful presentation mostly about auction theory, and more recently matching theory. And I must say, this is one area, both auction theory, but especially matching theory, where Turks have done pretty well in developing the field. And when I say pretty well, I mean as leaders of the field. Much of the work was done by Turks, actually in Turkey. I'll talk a little bit about that. So I will focus on the matching theory applications. That's my expertise, and I will mostly focus on my own research. And I'm glad Ali gave very good ideas about auction theory, and as well as empirics. So matching theory started with Gale and Shapley's 1962 paper, and in that very influential paper, they introduced a celebrated algorithm called deferred acceptance algorithm, where there are 2 sides of a market, boys and girls. Boys like girls, girls like boys. How should we match them so that everybody is happy, people do not divorce each other? That's the sort of model there. And until early 2000s, there was only one main application of that theory, and that was entry-level labor markets, typically hospital intern markets in the U.S. Interns have preference over residency programs. Residency programs have preference over prospective doctors, and the question is, how do you match them? So that was the main application. That's typically known as a 2-sided matching problem. Now, this trend has changed a lot in the last 15 years as matching theory found new applications in resource allocation problems of social importance. And it is with this new wave, Turks took a rather important role. And research in 2 applications has been especially influential, both in theory and also in the field, in practice. One is about assignment of students to schools, also known as school choice. And another application is kidney exchange. I will just briefly mention school choice, some of the practical developments, and mostly focus on kidney exchange. I've been very lucky to be deeply involved with both classes of problems. So indeed, the first of these problems, school choice problems, was first studied at Koç University, Turkey, and the initial problem was about modeling Turkish college admissions. That is how that literature literally started. So that I've done with Michel Balinsky. And the idea was modeling Turkish college admissions. And then a few years later, I also realized that some of the issues that was present Turkish college admissions, issues meaning some of the handicaps of the matching system that I identified and characterized and offered solutions for, were present in several US school districts at the larger level, actually. Now, I didn't have much luck with policymakers and such in Turkey. Indeed, one dean at my university told me that it's great that I'm interested in all these problems, but I should be crazy to think that anybody would listen to me, the policy service. I mean, my friends know that I'm not very good at taking a no as an answer, and I'm a fairly persistent guy. So I didn't like that, and that's one of the reasons why we eventually had to move to U.S. Because we found applications in the U.S., and that was the focus of the second paper. Now, this second paper, unlike the first paper, actually got lots of attention. We were very lucky. Excuse me, I'm blocking it. You can't hear me.
Move it up a bit on your...
Wow. Nobody ever tells me they cannot hear me. I'm a very loud person. And I'm sort of loud. I'm sorry. I mean, thank you. So this second paper actually became news in Boston Globe. And because one major application was about the failure of Boston Public School, Boston matching system. And, I took the paper, newspaper story, together with my research program, and I sent it to, Boston Public Schools Superintendent Thomas Payson, together with 20 other school districts, which also are using the same mechanism, and also to some newspaper, people, hoping that maybe they might also make a similar story in other cities. And Boston returned back to me. And we started talking and so on and so forth. And to make the long story short, indeed, also, joining force with Al Roth at MIT and his student Parag Patak, we convinced Boston Public Schools, and this movement eventually led to a cascade event where the mechanisms that we proposed in these papers was adopted by New York City, Boston, New Orleans, Denver, Washington, D.C., and many, many, many other places. So I failed in Turkey, but things went very, very well in the U.S., actually. So, and you're good. I'm sorry. Let's try again. Okay. Okay. So things went well in the U.S., and it still is, and several school districts are adopting these mechanisms in the U.S. And perhaps more strikingly, the mechanisms that we were complaining about became illegal in entire UK. And all school districts, which are called, I think, local authorities, adopted these mechanisms. What about kidney exchange? So around the same time, we also started writing papers on kidney exchange. Me and Utku at Koç University again, and Al Roth at Harvard University. And these papers were taken very well, both by the academic community, and we also reached out to medical community. And we found the first kidney exchange program in the world which uses tools for market design and optimization, and we called it New England Program for Kidney Exchange. And following NEPK's example, numerous programs in the world adopted these techniques over the next decade. And indeed, funding is always a problem for researchers, right? And NSF was also having some trouble, and they were trying to protect, continue. They want to. There were some issues about the funding for the, economics program, social sciences program, and to when they were defending the program, the first example they gave was about kidney exchange. So in his 2011 Congress testimony, Dr. Myron Gutman emphasized that our research on kidney exchange has resulted in measurable gains for the U.S. taxpayer. So this research program really became the poster child. In a recent NSF Science Nation story, Nancy Lutz, the program director, remarked that, in addition, it's especially rewarding to see such a clear and immediate benefit to the public. So the topic, the main theme is about science and society, right? So here we see both science and society. So, and they emphasize that this research moved from abstract academic theory to real work direct impact very quickly. Okay, and indeed, this is from their, the material they circulated, it's catchy and so on and so forth. And indeed, in 2012, this research program received a Nobel Prize in economics, receiving even more attention. And so it's given for the theory of stable allocation and the practice of market design. And in the award presentation, the application that was very prominently featured that justified the award was actually, kidney exchange. This success story reflects not only achievements in nephrology, but also innovative research in matching theories, so on and so forth. It's only 8 years ago that Alban Roth and his colleagues published their first scientific study on the most efficient way to manage the benevolence of organ donors, so on and so forth. So here we actually clearly see how much people pay attention to the relevance of these results. I'm not suggesting that all research has to produce these outcomes, but we certainly benefited quite a big deal because of that. So now what I'll do is I will actually take a step back and try to give you a sense of what is it that we do, what is it that we produce, what insights we produce in the context of kidney exchange. So kidney transplants and in general organ shortage is a big problem. I mostly have access to data from US, so I will give numbers from US, but this is also a big deal in Turkey. And at the end, I will talk about Turkey, actually. What are the prospects for Turkey? So there are more than 100,000 patients on the wait list for deceased donor kidneys. These are cadaveric kidneys in US alone as of April 2016. The shortage increases by about 3,500 each year in the US. And even though transplants from living donors is a major source of transplant kidneys, they are often incompatible with the intended patients. So that's the problem. There are lots of donors there, willing donors, who want to give this gift, and yet they cannot because of some sort of a medical incompatibility. What we do is we try to handle that. We try to use these gifts efficiently, effectively. How is it that we can make use of these kidneys which are not being utilized? So that's the idea. When you want to have a transplant for kidney as well as for many organs, one medical constraint is the blood type compatibility. There are 4 blood types, AB, AB, and O. And in the absence of other complications, type O kidneys can be transplanted in any kidney. A can be transplanted to A or AB. B can be transplanted to B or AB. And AB can only be transplanted to AB. Okay? Now, O patient can only receive from O. That's one implication. Okay? Whereas AB can receive from anybody. That's assuming you don't have tissue type incompatibility and such. So to start with, there is a natural injustice in this problem. If you are an O patient, you start from behind, unfortunately. Okay. Another constraint is tissue type compatibility. So, so tissue has to do, this tissue type, HLA, has to do with some proteins we inherited from our Neanderthal ancestors, I believe. That's what I heard. What is critical here is sometimes even when you are blood type compatible, if you're a patient which received lots of blood transfusion, you start developing antibodies against those HLA proteins of the person who is donating to you. And then if you received an earlier transplantation, again you produce. Now, at that instance, it doesn't do anything. But later on, you cannot receive an organ from a person which shares the same genetic trait, same, HLA. What that means is some patients, especially if they receive lots of blood transfusions of, that's a female and gave birth, and then during that period they develop antibodies to the child, which also means that they develop antibodies to the husband, which means you are more likely to be able to donate to my wife than I am, and so on and so forth. So some people cannot accept a very large portion of the kidneys, even in the absence of blood type incompatibility. Others can receive anything, provided that blood type compatibility is no problem. There is another constraint, at least in the US, but with the exception of Iran, this is a problem pretty much everywhere. And the constraint is the 1984 National Organ Transplant Act makes paying for an organ for transplantation a felony. And it states that it shall be unlawful for any person to knowingly acquire, receive, or otherwise transfer any human organ for valuable consideration for use in human transplantation. So it's just saying you cannot buy and sell organs. Okay. Now, there are two major sources of transplantation. Deceased donors. So this is what happens when there's a traffic accident, organs are harvested, or some of them are. This also depends on the culture. In some cultures, mostly in the Western culture, it's more prominent. In Eastern cultures, it is less so. In Turkey, it is actually living donor, which is really, really prominent. But as far as the deceased donor kidneys are concerned, U.S. Congress views them as national resources, and they established the Organ Procurement and Transplantation Network, also known as OPTN. And OPTN had a contractor, UNOS, and UNOS oversees allocation of deceased donor kidneys. There is a well-defined rule for the allocation of those transplants, deceased donor transplants. So this was very, very organized. Living donors transplants were much less organized until 2004. In a typical story, until 2004, a patient identifies a willing donor, and if the transplant is feasible, it is carried out. And otherwise, the patient remains on the deceased donor queue while the donor returns home. So here we have a willing donor that we couldn't utilize. And that happens quite often. Maybe 30 to 40% of the cases this will happen. Now, between 2000 and 2004, though, additional possibilities have been utilized in a few cases manually through exchanges of donors between two incompatible pairs. And this is exactly what my research program is all about. Okay? So what happened in a few cases between 2000 and 2004? So suppose I would like to donate a kidney. I'm a blood type donor. I have a B blood type patient. I want to donate, and yet I cannot. But there is another A patient with a B donor in the opposite situation. What I can do is I can donate to their patient, and they can donate to my patient. So even though neither of us are able to donate to our loved one, collectively we can actually make this gift. Okay? This is a two-way kidney exchange. Now, we didn't invent this idea. It was invented by Rappaport in 1986. But it was practiced in a very, very thin way, perhaps with the exception of South Korea, actually starting with 1990s. which is a leader in this concept, actually, and implementation. Okay? So the idea was there, but it wasn't really implemented. Now, but over time, the problem gets bigger and bigger. And indeed, in 2000, the transplantation community issues a consensus statement declaring this as ethically acceptable, these exchanges. This is the best thing you'll hear from doctors. I mean, there are many doctors here. This doesn't need to be ethically accepted. That you don't need a declaration of this sort to carry it. It just reflects the overall enthusiasm about the concept. Okay? The consensus statement also urged all 4 operations to be carried out simultaneously so that we don't have a situation where I receive a kidney on Monday and then we completely disappear on Tuesday before donating our share. Okay? And people don't need to be malicious for that to happen. I mean, the donor can die in the middle, can be deemed ineligible in the middle, so on and so forth. Okay? So that's why you have all these operations simultaneously. The first kidney exchange in the U.S. was carried out in Rhode Island in 2000, but prior to formal organized kidney exchange clearinghouses, it was extremely rare. Only 5 two-way exchanges were carried out in New England in the 5 years between 2000 and 2004. So basically, if you have a lucky accident where people figure out that, in the dialysis room, then you might have an exchange. It was completely manual. I believe this is also how it is done in Turkey. Okay. So where do we get in the picture? In early 2000s, market designers observed that 2 main types of kidney exchanges conducted in the U.S. correspond to the most basic forms of exchanges in the housing allocation model of myself with Attila Abdulkadirov. So here we have a completely abstract model about on-campus housing. We are already excited that we have an application, and suddenly the main tools we developed there have a direct counterpart in this context. So I immediately know what can be done if these tools are actually used adequately, right? So building on existing practices in kidney transplantation, in a series of papers, Utku, where Alban wrote, and myself analyzed how an efficient and incentive-compatible system of exchanges might be organized and what its welfare implications might be. And this research program, the methodology and the techniques we advocated, provide the backbone of several kidney exchange programs in the US and elsewhere in the last 10 years. So what I'll do is I'll just try to give you a sense of, why is, okay, so once you have the idea of exchange, what is it there to show and what is it, what is it that I do to deserve to give this talk, okay? So I'll just give some very basic observations, nothing too mathematical, okay? Suppose we have just 4 pairs, pair 1, 2, 3, and 4. And what this graph represents is each pair, each node there is an incompatible pair. And if there's a link between them, they can actually swap kidneys, okay? Now, in this case, pair 1 can swap with pair 2 or pair 3, and pair 2 can swap with pair 4, okay? Now, if you're dealing with it in a system, if you have the system and dealing with it either on a first-come, first-served basis, and this is what happened in many cases, you can match 1 and 2, right? Well, that's a really bad idea. You just kill 2 people, right? Because you could have matched 1 and 3 and 2 and 4, providing a transplant for all patients rather than just 1 and 2. Okay, just this example itself shows that optimization in this context is important. Very simple observation. It turns out that gains from larger exchanges are very considerable. You can have 3-way exchanges, so on and so forth. 3-way exchange is more challenging. Why? Because now you need to have 6 simultaneous operations. And doctors resisted for that. But what we have shown analytically and also true by simulations is the gains from 3-way exchanges is more than 20%. And there is an analytical reason for that. It's not just a simulation. And this gain doesn't get smaller in a large population, even if the system is very big, okay? Once they see that, they actually started allowing for 3-way exchanges. We changed US policy in this matter. Now, occasionally, just 5 minutes.
I hate to be that guy, but...
Okay. So, occasionally somebody goes to the transplant center and says, you know, I want to donate a kidney. Okay? And they don't have a patient with them. Okay? Now, what you can do is that person can donate to an incompatible pair. Their patient can donate to another person, and so on and so forth. And one critical observation that we made was, you don't need to do these in a simultaneous way, actually. Why? Because now you are receiving before giving. And even if the chain breaks, I mean, if you do not use a large, if you do not allow for change, you are breaking it anyways. What's the point of breaking it with two transplants on the fear that it might eventually break, right? And indeed, this idea worked very well because it also helps logistics. So this also went very well. It turns out that there is some waste when you don't include compatible pairs. If I'm an A patient, Ali is my O donor. When I receive his O kidney, we just actually lost an opportunity to save somebody else. Why? Well, because an O patient, unless they have an O donor, will automatically go to exchange pool. They can never directly receive. But the other way around is correct only when, I will only not be able to receive Ali's kidney, Ali's O kidney, only if there's a tissue type incompatibility. So you see all this unbalance in the pool. Okay? If we could include us in the pool, we could have saved a lot of people. So that's another insight. And the last insight I want to mention is there are economies of scale in this problem. Okay? Now, the larger the program, the better. The share of kidney exchange started with teens around 2004. It increased to more than 500 by 2010. That is 10% of all living donation in the US now. Okay? Now, so let me just give you a snapshot of, how we have done with these criteria, and I have to rush with this. In terms of organization and optimization of kidney exchange, we have done very well. Indeed, a little bit too well. There are just too many people doing that, too many programs. I wish we had a few bigger programs. What about larger exchanges? This became very widespread. Integration of altruistic donors via kidney exchanges. You can see, like we can now have very big, cycles, chains initiated by altruistic donors. But we couldn't do well with inclusion of compatible kidneys, and we ended up with many small programs in the US. Okay? So I'll skip those. And with UTCO, we have a specific idea to deal with these missing points that we would like to push. So basically the idea is, if I'm a patient, if Ali is my O donor, even though we do not need to go through exchange, if we go, we'll save another life today. And the system can encourage that by giving me priority in the cadaveric list in the future if I need a repeat transplant. So you can do this with money, but that's offensive to many people. But instead of getting money, perhaps I can be incentivized with a priority in the cadaveric rule. We show that this helps every single group, actually. Okay. So now what is the potential for Turkey? Two factors key for the promise of a successful living donor organ exchange program. One is the compliance with the laws. For instance, in Germany, it's not legal to have an exchange. And the second is prominence of living donation and expertise in transplantation. So how are these in Turkey? So these ideas are especially fruitful if there is lots of living donation as opposed to cadaveric donation. So both factors are very favorable for Turkey. First of all, kidney exchange is occasionally carried out manually, so it is legal. There's no legal problem. If you look at kidney transplant rate in the world, in terms of living donation, Turkey is #1. You have some of the best transplant surgeons, actually, in Turkey. This is a field where we are extremely strong, and which means there are lots of living donation going on. Well, we can increase this number by at least 20%. And certainly there is a lot of need for that. çocuklarını kurtarmak için böbrek takası yapacak aileler. That's one of the news. And you see these again and again. Why don't we have a system? Now, even though I'm talking about kidneys, you can implement related ideas for liver exchanges. We invented the concept of lung exchange, actually, and working with Japanese transplant surgeons to conduct the first lung exchange in the world. But for living donation from livers, Turkey is number 2 in the world. So the conditions are extremely favorable in Turkey to launch by far the most successful organ exchange, living donor exchange programs in Turkey. We started these ideas in Turkey, in Istanbul, have been able to save many, many lives throughout the world, and yet we cannot implement these ideas in Turkey. I think this is something we should correct. Okay. So I guess the conclusion is apparent. Economists just don't, deal with money, markets where money is the primary tool. We can actually rely from our expertise and ideas in designing markets where money is not a tool to use. Well, thank you very much for your patience.